The phone? Don't think I forgot. It's microphone. It's microphone right now. It's working for the microphone.
Yes.
All right, so there we go. All right, so we're getting ready to start. Brother Carson's going to do it. Let everybody know online that we're getting ready to start class. So, all right, we're going to do that.
Good morning. If you would, please turn in your song books to number 514. Number 514. We'll sing the first and last verse of number 514, and then we'll be dismissed to our classes. Let us sing. I'm in the way, the bright and shining way. I'm in the glory land way. Telling the world that Jesus saves today. Yes, I'm in the glory land way. I'm in the glory land way. Let's go to our classes.
While they're all going to their class, does anybody need a outline? Same one as last week. All right, go and hand these out. Anyone else? This way you walk through. It's a simple outline. It's pretty simple, but more scriptures. Anybody else? Anyone else need one? I got extras now, so if anyone wants one themselves, they can. Anybody? All right, we'll leave it at that. All right. I'll just say this, everybody probably hears my voice a little different today, and it usually is I guess the weather coming in, something draining a little bit, so I just have to deal with that. I won't lose my voice, at least I say that, but it'll be just a little different. So we want to welcome everyone here with us. If you turn your Bibles with me to Psalm chapter 3, we're going to continue our study in the book of Psalms as we look at that and continue with what we see there. Just a second, there we go. As we see this area there in Psalms, and we've been talking about the study that's happening here and the importance that we see with it, knowing that the book of Psalms is actually divided into 5 different books. We said 5 divisions, and we've all been doing this for about a month now, going through the study, and as I said, we're not going to do a very extensive study in each chapter, but we're going to do a study of each book and see each division and see what's going on there. The first division, chapters 1 through 41, will be the most extensive. We'll go through quite a bit of it, looking at different areas to kind of just get us in line with where we are. If you remember last week, we talked about that. We spoke of Psalm chapter 1 and 2 and the importance of it being the gateway, the entryway into Psalms. And we discussed a lot about going on there. And just remind us also, as we look at this, that we want to deal with this to basically get a big picture of the nature of God, that we'd say is theology, and the study of religion of all of the Psalms, of what takes place here. We wanted to make the Psalms more helpful and more usable to each and every one of us as we live in this life and as we go through day to day. And we want to better know each individual psalm, basically where it fits in its place. We talk about that they're not chronological, but we know, understanding that the way God had them put together, that we see that there is a reason behind them, the way they are put together. And we said sometimes you'll read a psalm and it'll seem like it's out of place, but we said there's a reason for that. We'll discuss those psalms that are like that. Usually, as we stated, when we usually read into the psalms, we basically just pick one here, one there, and go through them like that, and not really realize how they are put together or that they even are put together in a certain way. Ultimately, we stated with the Psalms when we get into this is that we want to see Christ at the center of the book of Psalms. That's what it's all about here, seeing Jesus in it. And so that we can become better knowing. And as we think about this, the knowing that is there, the knowing, loving, and trusting Him in all that He is and everything about Him. And as it will mature us, we can mature in our walk with Christ as we go through this daily lives. So last week, as we stated, we left off here at chapter 3, and this first division, book 1 of Psalm 1 through 41. And we talked about how this psalm traces the path of David. It traces the path of David's rise to the throne through many afflictions, and knowing that, reflecting the conflict we saw in the opening 2 psalms, that these psalms really largely describe the period of David, that is God's anointed one, and how he was confronted by his enemies, confronted so often with everything they're dealing with and everything they're going through. Also, all of this area, that's basically all of chapter 1 through 41, except for chapter 10 and chapter 33. These psalms are, we understand, attributed to David in a different way, knowing David in his personal struggle. His personal struggle with that battle that's not just taking place physically, but we would call that cosmic battle in a sense. Those battles taking place in the background. As we know in Ephesians, everyone look at Ephesians. I want to remind you of this chapter, Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12. And I know I've got you Psalm 3. Go and hold that, because we'll be coming back to that. In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12, we know Paul here talking to Ephesus, understanding that there are those that are, it's a battle for our soul, and not just of blood, of our physical bodies, but our spiritual bodies, our spiritualness, that soul that we have. And it says here in verse 12, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." Now we go back, we know Paul dealing in the first century, they had miracles, they had things going on, yet demon-possessed people and so on. And sometimes you may think, that only applies to the first century. That's not the case, brethren. We need to realize that. Of course, there aren't demons like that anymore. The miracles working like that anymore. We know 1 Corinthians 13. But we do know that the devil still wants our soul. And we know that evil persists in this world. And there are things out there that really want to see us lose our battle. So as we look at this, we think back to David. When we think about and realizing that David, in this large role, has this large role, we wonder, why does he have such a large role in the book of Psalms? And we may ask, why are so many of them written by him, really when it comes down to it, in the first person? And we mentioned that, and I'm just basically repeating what I said last week for a moment, that David's first person addressed to God in the Psalms should be understood when we look at it in the terms of a covenant, Old Testament, redemptive history, which God made with David. We want to be able to look back to it and see what God did with David. In other words, we know and understand that David wrote down his experiences, his reflections, his experiences, and as he reflected upon them of what was taking place there, and that he wasn't just writing as an individual. That's what we need to get from there. He was writing as an anointed king. He was writing as one that basically, turn on the volume, as one we understand as basically God's representative on earth, as one who would foreshadow the great Messiah. I guess I'm pretty loud online, sounds like. So, but I'm looking at that as well, all those who would be united with the Messiah. And that's what this is about, brethren, once again. It's about you and I understanding that David's experiences, his emotions, all point to Christ's experiences and Christ's emotions, things that he went through, which actually comes back to us, which helps us identify the fellowship that we have with Jesus. So Psalm 3, let's all get there. Psalm 3, and this is where we actually left off last week at the end of the class. Psalm chapter 3. And we discussed here that on one level we know it is David describing the tragic situation which basically took place with his own son. Anybody remember the name of the son that usurped his throne? Starts with an A. Absalom. That's exactly right. As we know, Absalom, 2 Samuel chapter 15 and following, we see him realize that he rose up against him, took the throne. And so we know David had to flee. And we see these things happening here. He actually wanted David dead in a sense. And remember, God made it very clear to David that the sword wasn't going to leave his house with everything that happened between him and Bathsheba and Uriah and all those things. And we see this part of that, of what's taking place here. So we understand when David has problems, they're not just his problems. Who does it impact? When we see it right here, when David has problems, who does his problems impact? The whole nation of Israel, the whole kingdom, because he's king. So we see this happening. So all this is taking place here, which brings us to verses 7 and 8 that we read last week. Verses 7 and 8. And it says, "Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. For you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing is upon your people." So we see this here very quickly, that David wants to understand, and wants us to understand, is he's not just singing this song, it's more of a prayer of what's going on here, is that David realizes that God will save him. He realizes what God has done for him. And he realizes because of this, God will bless him. And he's still even doing this during this time of tribulation, during this time of difficulties, during this time of pursuit, in a sense, from his son and the people that his son has basically taken over, which takes us to verse 3. Everyone jump backwards now to verse 3. It says, "But you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory, and one who lifts up my head." Remember when we talked about this right before we closed? I was very quick in this. The shield, we think back to Ephesians chapter 6, usually with the armor, that the armor that we are to wear. When is a shield effective? When is a shield effective? When you have it in front of you. It's exactly right. If we put the shield down and move away from it, how easy is it for us to be hit by the waves of Satan? Very easy. Very, very easy. It's going to happen more likely. And we see it. Now with the shield, we know Satan's still going to try to attack us. And this is what David's getting at. But he says when God is his shield, he knows without a doubt that he can get through all things. In fact, if you remember all the way back to Genesis chapter 15, verse 1, God told Abraham here when he was Abram, he made it very clear. He says, about leaving his countryside, when he was going through he said, God said, "I will be your shield." And this is the same demonstration that David understands this, which brings us to verse 4 that we haven't talked about yet. Everyone look at verse 4. He says, "I cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me from his holy hill." See, the Lord's dwelling place on earth, even that there at this Jerusalem, even though Absalom is occupying the throne in Zion, notice here, very important, temporarily. He's only going to be there temporarily. Zion, notice, is still the Lord's dwelling place. Now, we need to realize that it shows us here that God can do whatever he wants. God doesn't need people, but he chooses to. He chooses to have us created. He chooses to have those things happen, knowing that we can be saved through Christ, his son, Jesus Christ. But even with Absalom there, God knows what's going to take place, that he's going to bring David back. And he wants the people to understand. There it is. Even though Absalom is there, he doesn't follow, he doesn't care for what Absalom's doing at all. It's sinful what Absalom's doing, trying to usurp the anointed one's king and throne, as we see there, David. But God's wanting the people to know, I'm still with you. I'm still there for you. I will help you through this. And he wants David to know, very importantly, and David does, that God's saying, I am not going to abandon Jerusalem. And so when he sees this, David's able to say the other things that he says in Psalm 3, which brings us back to verse 8. Look back to verse 8 again. David, in the midst of this awful turmoil and conflict, David can rest securely. Someone read verse 8 for us. Look what he says there in verse 8 again. Verse 8.
Salvation belongeth unto the Lord, thy blessing is upon thy people.
Thank you. So salvation belongs to the Lord. Who is the blessing upon? Ricky was about to read that there. I think was Ricky reading that also? Okay, Terry. So it was in stereo there. Terry, what does he say there at the end? Say your blessing is upon who? Anybody know? Upon your people. And this is what David realized. And he wants the people to understand. So we should learn, here's what it's all about. We need to learn to pray like David did. That's what this is here. We need to learn to pray like David did when we are in what? What's he doing right now? Is it things going good for him? He's in turmoil, trouble, the things that are happening. Should we, a lot of times, most people we see even in the world that aren't godly people, when something happens, if they believe in God, when they have something go really bad in their life, what do? They usually go to God. And things get better, what do? They forget about it. Is this the way it should be for Christians? People that follow God? Never, not whatsoever. So what we find here is that 30 of the first 41 verse chapters in this first book make reference to the enemies of the psalmist. So I want you to see how bad it was for David. 30 of the chapters of 41 do this. And the remaining 11 psalms, what they do is they imply, 3 of them imply the presence of enemies. And then we know that 5 refer to death. Now, when we read that, we go, who wants to read chapter 1 through 41? When all that it is about is enemies of God, it's about death, and it's implying the presence of enemies. We're all like, no way. There's no reason. I just skip over that and go to book 2. Brethren, we never want to do that. Because book 1 is so important. Because what it does, it basically unites what we find here with David, being in this constant struggle with his enemies, how he seeks to establish the Messianic kingdom of righteousness and peace with the people and with God. Therefore, as we stated this here, as we understand, when we look at this, chapters 1 through 41 is going to teach us how to deal with trouble. It's going to teach us how to deal with tribulation. It's going to teach us how to deal with problems, conflicts, whatever are going on in this life. Which brings us to verse 5. I want you to notice verse 5 now, because this is important to get here. What we're going to see and understand is that chapter 3, 4, 5, and 6, actually 3 through 7 in a sense, we wonder, are they all dealing with Absalom? Some people, commentators, others will say, nope, that just doesn't make sense. Brother, I disagree wholeheartedly. It totally makes sense because of what we find here. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Remember we talked about clues in the book of Psalms. We're trying to find things, the Bible is its own best commentary. Things that are being tied together that would make sense in a situation. So here, chapter 3, verse 5. Someone go and read that for us. Chapter 3, verse 5, please.
I lay me down and slept. I wait for the Lord to sustain me.
Okay, so here we go. So he says, I lay down to sleep and woke and the Lord sustained me. So you look at this here, what he's dealing with, what he's going through, sustaining him. Now look at chapter 4. I want you to show there's a theme here in each one of these. Chapter 4, verse 4. Someone go and read that verse for us, please. Actually, verse 4 and verse 8. Of chapter 4.
And sin not. Commune with your own heart upon your bed and be still.
And verse 8 also, please.
I will both lay me down in peace and sleep. For thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety.
Thank you. Now chapter 5. Whenever this is, chapter 5, verse 3. Someone go and read that verse.
My voice shalt thou hear in the morning, O Lord. In the morning will I direct my prayer unto thee, and will look up.
Thank you. And then chapter 6, verse 6.
I am weary with my sighing. Every night I make my bed swim. I dissolve my couch with my tears.
Thank you. So now think about this for a moment. You hear anything in common in these verses? Something's happening and then happening again. Anybody see what's going on common here?
Grief, trouble, and prayer.
Sleep, prayer, trouble, anything else? When you think about, notice you talk about the morning and the night. So it sounds like here, going to sleep, as we stated, waking up or going to bed and waking up. In a sense, we find here. What we find is that it's possibly all connected by the idea of sleeping and waking in the morning to the time when Absalom stole David's throne. That's what we see in these chapters here. It's important to realize this, that David's trying to show us that while he was going through this every day, every morning, every night that he went to bed, every morning that he woke up, he was dealing with this. How was he dealing with it though? Did it seem like he was getting through it, or did it seem like he was angry and mad at God that God allowed this to happen?
He was getting through it.
He was getting through it. They seem as these, basically the hostility that's against David and the pattern of the night and day, it lets us notice that even though David was dealing with this from day to day, he was getting through it. You know, how often when we deal with things from day to day, just continual going, after probably 4 or 5 days of 6 days of 7 days of, what do a lot of people do? They start giving up, or they start giving in, is another way to think about it. Giving into the devil, giving into the ways of this world, or whatever's bothering them, what's happening here. So that's what I want us to really understand, because there's 55 verses here. I'm doing this. 55 verses here in this area, and that are devoted to the enemies and their threats. But about 30 verses here, we understand, are devoted to truths about, let me see, 3 to 7, I get right, 15 verses are devoted to the enemies, but 30 here are devoted to the truths of the Lord and the description of prayer and praise that David brings forth to God. You know, this is what it's showing us, that even in times of trouble, when it doesn't seem like it's fixing, we can't give up on God. Because guess what He's not going to do?
He's not going to give up on us.
He's not going to give up on us. Dad, yes.
Yeah, I was just, the very first verse you read, verse 5 says, when he awoke, God sustained him.
Yep.
And that's what we need to understand, that when we're in trouble like this, God sustains us. He carries us through. It's not anything we can do, but it has to be a reliance upon God.
That's exactly
That's
right.
what David did.
That's exactly right. And there's the difference. A lot of times what happens is we start thinking, what can I do to make myself better? To get through these days of everything's happening. And as was just stated, we need to rely on God to get us through it. Now, it doesn't mean we don't do our part, because we have to, if we're relying on God, we're doing our part. And that's what we see here. So like David, we need to face our problems and describe them. And yet at the same time, when we deal with these, allow the great truths about God to outweigh our circumstances. Do you think God's truths can outweigh any circumstances you're in? Without a doubt, we know they can. And that's what He's trying to show us here and wants us to get this. So that's what these areas are about. So when we look at something like this, chapter 1 to 41, and we think this is just chapters of horrible things happening. There are horrible things happening, but it's describing to us how to get through them and how to deal with them. Which brings us to verse 8. So here you have chapter 3 through 7, you know, just almost seems negative in a sense of what David's going through, but he's relying on God. And then you get to verse 8, and it's like a breath of fresh air. For Psalm 8 is about creation, and it takes us back to Genesis 1 and 2. In fact, everyone look at there. Psalm 8. I'm going to go ahead and read it. Psalm 8. It says this, O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth, who have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babes and nursing infants, you have ordained strength because of your enemies, that you may silence the enemy and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have ordained, what is man, that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man, that you visit him? For you have made him a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor. You have made him to have dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, even the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, the fish of the sea that pass through the paths of the seas. O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth. You see the song there, right? We see the song that we sing and understand. So here's a praise song about God as creator, but also God's care for all his creatures. And this is what we find. So I want you to think about everything that David just went through, that all of a sudden this psalm's placed in. This is one of those psalms that people think is out of place. They go, why would you do it? Do you think it makes sense to see chapter 3 and 7 that David's dealing with Absalom, everything that's going on, all the difficulties, he's relying on God, and then you have a chapter 8 like this to jump in here and say, guess what? Remember, God created you. God is in control of everything. He allows us to make choices and decisions, but at the same time, he's willing to do everything for us. You know, that's a reassurance. You know, when you think about that, that's how we look at life. When we're down, when things are bad, and then things get better again, we need to thank God and realize that and thank God for who he is and what he's about. But it doesn't stop. It doesn't only happen when things are going good. We have to do it always. That's what gets us through things. So here's this glorious view of God, properly humbling views of ourselves, And so we see here of this happening, of the turmoil and hostility in chapters 3 through 7. And then all of a sudden we see this next psalm of basically of refreshment, a break that people need. And that we see here with David. In fact, everyone turn over with me to Hebrews chapter 2. I want you to see something for a second here. Hebrews chapter 2. There is more here than just referring to human beings. Guess who this chapter is actually applied to? Anybody know who this chapter 8 is actually applied to? Besides you and I, who it's really applied to? Remember we said, who's the center of all the Psalms? Who is to be found at the center of all the Psalms? Jesus Christ. This is who this is talking about here. In fact, Hebrews 2, everyone look at there. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 5 through 9. We know it applies it to this psalm. The writer does this. Someone go ahead and read for us. And you're going to hear it right here in Hebrews chapter 2, beginning in verse 5. 5 through 9, please.
For unto the angels hath he not put in subjection the world to come whereof we speak, but one in a certain place testified, saying, What is man that thou art mindful of him, or the son of man that thou visitest him? Thou madest him a little lower than the angels, thou crownest him with glory and honor, and didst set him over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things in subjection under his feet, for in that he put all in subjection under him. He left nothing that is not put under him. But now we see not yet all things put under him. But we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he by the grace of God should taste death for every man.
Thank you. So when you take Psalm 8 and you apply it here to Hebrews chapter 2, which we see being done by the Hebrew writer, it shows us the confidence that David was writing about, that he found in that Messianic time would come through Christ, and knowing that everything would be a part of him and everything through him, and that you and I could have that same relationship, that same establishment, knowing that we're established in our Lord and Savior, just like we see David leading to that direction of what is there. So that's what we see in that chapter 8. Really there, it's about it. I don't want to go a whole lot of detail, but just understanding that, when we think about the creation, a lot of times we can't just think about what God created as in things around us, but who we are. Who are we created after? God said he created us in whose image? His image. And so when we see something like this, we say, oh, I need to be like Jesus like this. I need to continue what is here, just like David would understand. Which brings us now to Psalm 9 and 10. Everyone jump forward now to Psalm 9 and 10. Any comments or questions before we move into this? Psalm 9 and 10 are an interesting chapter because we know when we look at it in the Hebrew that they were actually used to be one chapter. The way they were written. It wasn't separated. It was one. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in these, but we know that together 9 and 10 basically talk about an aspect of faith, that our faith is found in God the Father and in His Son. 9, 1 through 12 talks about confident faith. So you should have that in your outline there. Second one, chapter 9, 13 through chapter 10, verse 6, deals with the disciplined faith. It's kind of like the discipline that Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians 9:27 about buffeting our body and the importance that comes with it. And then the third part is praying faith. So 10, 7 through 18. And I'm not going to go over those. I just wanted you to see that and just to realize that, we deal with faith things all the time. But I would go here, I would mark these where you can go back and you can see where David talked about his confident faith, his disciplined faith, and then yes, even his praying faith. Because he understood that the only way to be confident was to be obedient to God. And the only way to be obedient to God is to understand that he would continue prayerfully in following him and looking to him and being guided by everything that he has. Which brings us now to there's seven more Psalms, chapter 11 through 17. And it's very possible to take the first three, this, like I said, it's going to be real quick, 11 through 13 as one unit, and the last three, 15 through 17, as a second unit. With Psalm 14 in the middle, it's the central psalm in the section. Now, I know everybody's looking at this going, okay, Ernie, what does this mean? I just want to point that out. I'm not going to go over those chapters. I really don't want to do them right now. We may come back to these later, but I just want us to get a realize of understanding of what's happening here. So as we look at these, I guess you'd say, let me see. I'm just going to move on. Psalm 14. There is something I want you to read in Psalm 14. Everyone go back over there. Psalm 14. What we understand when we look to this is that as we look at Psalm 14 is repeated almost verbatim. So Psalm 14 is repeated almost verbatim in Psalm 53. Now, the Psalm 53 is going to talk about it, and the reason for this is because of what happens here. So everyone look at Psalm 14. Psalm 14 is a good divider, as we said. What it's talking about here is David is talking about relying on God and the importance. Then he gets to chapter 14, and it's about the foolishness, godless people, those who are not wanting to, do what's right. He's talking about godless people wanting to restore Israel, things that are happening and taking place. In fact, chapter 14 exposes atheism. Now, what do we think when we think of atheism? When we hear that word?
People that don't believe in God.
People that don't believe there's a God. Everyone look at Psalm 14, verse 1, and notice what David says here. Psalm 14, verse 1. So we want to read that. Sorry.
The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none that doeth good.
So think about this. Could you imagine, have you ever had anybody tell you there's no God? You know anybody like that? It's interesting, you get back to a small town, and I say small compared to where we were at, before here, you get a small town, and it's interesting, like turn on the radio, you hear the radio talking about God. You talk to certain people, you hear people talking about God. You just see certain signs around town talking about God. And it's refreshing, and it's different than what you have when you get into the world that is really against God. Like where we were at, I told you before, 35 miles just south of D.C., and you don't hear a lot of people talking about God. In fact, you hear people just talking the opposite about God, saying we don't need church, we don't need God, and it's really displeasing and it's hurtful. And when you think about it, you go, how does God feel about that? Now here's the nation, the capital of our nation, and that's how a lot of it is up there. It's remarkable when you bring that together and you start thinking about, it's good to be in a small town. You think about that and how it comes. So here what David wants us to understand here in Psalm 14 is that David is talking more than likely about one individual. And this individual is named Nabal. And remember Nabal, he was married to who? He was the husband of who? Anybody know? Look at your history. Abigail. And so we see this with Nabal. We realize that it makes a lot of sense because everyone turn over to Romans chapter 3. I want everyone to look at Romans chapter 3. Paul is going to quote from Psalm 14. Paul is going to quote from Psalm 14 in chapter 3 because the Roman Empire, when we think about the Roman Empire, who did the Roman Empire really worship? Who did they worship? Was it just one God? How many gods? Hundreds and hundreds of different gods. We see them worshiping. And we see others, they also worship, we know when Paul was there, they're worshiping unknown God. They wanted to make sure that they had every box checked is what they were trying to do as we see this happening here. But Paul makes it very clear to them. He said, you're not worshiping the right God. And when you're not, you're basically in a sense saying there is no God. Romans chapter 3. Everyone look at Romans chapter 3 and notice beginning, actually in verse 9, we're going to see here that he's talking about the advantage of the Jew, what is profit, of them, circumcision and so on. And he goes into different things about judging the world, and he gets to verse 9, and he says, what then? Are we better than they? Not at all. For we previously charged both Jews and Greeks that they are all under sin. As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks after God. They have all turned aside. They have together become unprofitable, and there is none who does good, no, not one. So now here he's going back to Psalms, we said, and quoting from that. Could you imagine living in a society that doesn't look to God at all? The God, the Creator, everything. Could you imagine that? I'm serious. I'm trying to think about what I'm saying. Could you imagine living in Cedartown and that nobody talks about God except for you thinking about Him? How do you think life would be? What's that?
It wouldn't be good.
Wouldn't be good? Would it be difficult? How do you think day to day would go? How do you think people would treat each other? Bad. You think people would be like real nice?
Yeah.
Like, hey, yeah, they bump into you. What do you think is going to happen if you bump into them? You want to fight you right then. I mean, because God is love. And when love dissipates and is gone, guess what happens? Evil gets put in place. Hatred. Things happen and go on. Anarchy goes crazy. And we see that happen. You look at countries of the world that don't look to God at all and what's going on there. You look even in our own country, what we see happening from time to time. And we see that. And when we rely on God, though, when we understand this, and this is what David is getting at, that we too have to continue to expose what is good, but at the same time expose what is evil. Now, that doesn't mean that we go out and tell everybody, you're a terrible person, you're not going to be in heaven. That's not what it is. We want to show people who God is and show them the love that is found in Him and the importance. And when we're able to spread that in our own community, we can go out into other areas of the world and do the same thing. And this is what David wants us to understand, and Paul here, that when we are in an area that doesn't even look to God, how great is it to be the person and have the opportunity of spreading His word? That's what we see. So as we step back, we get the bigger picture here, brethren. We see in chapter 3 through 19 are all part of the Davidic collection of the Psalm of David, book 1. Then, so that's it. That's all the way through there through 19. Any comments or questions? We're going to jump into this next area that I'm sure everybody will, excited to study, probably to look at. And Psalm 20 through 41, it basically comprises the second part of all this. So you have book 1 kind of divided into 2 in a sense, just for a study. Not that it's actually divided that way, but it's just for our study to understand certain things. Verse 22, chapter 22. Anybody know the best way to probably classify Psalm 22? What to call it? What would you think if you know Psalm 22? Who's it talking about?
Oh, it's messianic prophecy.
Messianic prophecy. And so Messianic prophecy is always about who? Messianic, we know Jesus. When we see it's about Him. The only way to understand this, and I'm going to teach this right here in a sense of, years ago, actually when I was in preacher school, we had one of the instructors was going to be teaching was going to be in a lectureship and asked us about putting this class together or this lesson together, and we did. And we put it together, helping him and showing the importance of it, of what Psalm 22 is. His actual understanding was Matthew 27. And it deals with there where it says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? I mentioned this the other day, probably, maybe my second week here or something like that when we were talking about certain things. But it all goes back to those words, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which we see, those same words as, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? In Psalm 22. So everyone turn to Matthew 27. I want everyone to turn to Matthew 27 first. And you'll hold Psalm 22. You come back to that. Matthew 27. Now I will say this. Not all people see this in the same way that I'm going to teach this today. And what I mean by that, don't think I'm teaching false doctrine. I would never do that. I'm not going to do that. All I'm going to show you here is it makes perfect sense when we use the Bible as its own best commentary and understanding what God was getting at. And it'll come alive. You'll understand if you haven't seen this before, which I'm sure you probably have, but I'm going to explain it anyways. Matthew 27, and I'm not going to get far into it because I only have 5 minutes left, actually 4 minutes left. So someone go ahead and read for us Psalm 27, verse 46. Now remember, what is taking place here in Psalm 27? Jesus is where? What is it talking about with Jesus? Being on the cross. And so we see this happening. So this will be what we would call that, I believe I'm right, the fourth words from him. So someone go ahead and read Matthew 27, verse 46.
About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, that is, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Okay, so when he reads this, if you are just taking this one verse and pulling it by itself, it sounds like God did what with Jesus? Left him alone. Now, when I mean left him alone, that doesn't mean just, I'm going to let you deal with this on your own because you're God too. It sounds like he actually did what? Abandoned him when you read that verse. And that's what a lot of people come to the context of thinking here. When they look at Matthew 27, verse 46, they think that God the Father actually abandoned Jesus on the cross because they say he was what? They say Jesus was sin. And we need to understand when we look at this. The Bible says it that way, but it's actually what it's saying in the Greek. And we'll look as we go through it. I will say this. most people get to this conclusion that God can't look on Jesus because he sinned, because of what has been taught about the book of Habakkuk. Everyone turn over the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk chapter 1. Now Habakkuk chapter 1, it's one of those where I'd say you go to the end of the Bible and just move back a couple chapters there and you find it. Habakkuk, Habakkuk chapter 1, and I'm going to go ahead and read this to you. Verse 13. When people want to believe that God forsook Jesus because he became an offering for sin, this view is based on Habakkuk 1:13. It states this: you are of purer eyes. It's talking about God, the Father. You are of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. Now the King James Version says what? It says iniquity, right? Does it say that? Is that what it says? Am I right? Iniquity. What is iniquity? What is that giving reference to? What word? Sin. So we see here. It says you cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who dealt treacherously, and behold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? The first part of the verse is what's always taken and used. And brethren, I would say this: when people use this with Matthew 27:46, they are using this out of context, in a sense. And I'll show you what I mean by it. They're saying Jesus is sin. And now we need to realize, is that really what's going on here? See, the word forsaken, here's what's important to understand. This is what the word forsaken is, so you can really get it to see if God the Father did this with Jesus the Son on the cross. In the Hebrew, it actually has the meaning of a breach of a relationship. A breach of a relationship. Do you think the relationship between God and his Son was broken? Anybody think that? Any of us think that? I mean, hopefully not, because then we're saying, think about this. If we're saying if that's the case, that relationship was broken, we say, could Jesus truly be God on earth?
No.
No, without a doubt. See, there's a huge difference between God not being able, because of his holiness, here it is, Habakkuk 1:13, to look on Jesus as a sin offering. There's the difference. And actually forsaking his own Son. Habakkuk, if you look at it that way and realizing exactly what it means, that yes, God is too holy to look at sin. God is too holy to become a part of what is going on in sin. But Jesus, was he sin or was he a sin offering? And that's what really comes down to this. And we know when we go all the way back to the times of before Jesus, when they sacrificed animals, did they always say the animal was the sin? What did they call the animal? Don't think I'm calling Jesus an animal. What do they call that? The animal. I heard it. A sin offering. And this is where we need to get to this, which I'm out of time. Everyone's like, oh, come on. It was just getting pretty good. Matthew 27:46. So we will come back to that next week, and we will discuss this. I'll tell you, go read. Please, go read Matthew 27:46, and then go again and read Psalm 22. When you read Psalm 22, you're going to see the cross come alive there in that chapter. You're going to see it. You're going to see it actually exactly what we read about in the New Testament. And it's important because that was the whole purpose behind it, for Jesus to let these people realize what was happening. That Jesus won. He did not lose. They could not lose their faith in God the Father or Jesus. He had victory and he would make it through it. And we'll come back to that next week. Any comments or questions before we close? None? All right, we'll close there. Thank you. Appreciate it.